Module 5, Instruction. We've now reached the point where we're going to turn a little bit away from curriculum for at least a week and look at the instructional process. Now, there are whole courses that could be devoted just to this topic alone, and yet I have basically 1 week to present some things on instruction. And I just know that there's not going to be any way possible to do that. But I do want to state some general points about instruction. Many of you are already accomplished teachers, and so you have many more instructional tools in your tool belt than could possibly even be contained in a course. So what I want to present to you are some general ideas about instruction, but begin by talking about the planning process and how we get ready to teach, and the work that we have to put in before we teach a lesson. And so that's where we're going to be this week, and hopefully this is going to be something that will refresh you. Now, you teach every day, and I suspect that you have seen all of the strategies that have kind of come down the road from experts at other universities and disciplines. So what I want this to be is just kind of let's call ourselves back to attention to what we already know and make sure that we're doing the things that we know that work. Most of you have to develop some kind of lesson plan, and it may be as simple as identifying a topic or a chapter from a textbook, the assignment that's going to be given, and that's about it. You don't go into great depth, and although some of you have to go into a lot more depth, I would be willing to guess that you put more time and attention into the lesson plans that you developed as part of your preparation program than you did when you got the job. And in many schools, they don't require detailed lesson plans. So in the first aspect of planning for instruction, we need to decide, are we going to write goals? Not even talking about curriculum or instruction goals, as this slide indicates, but are we going to identify some overarching targets that we're going to achieve? And then certainly, but not listed here, are we going to develop lesson objectives to know whether or not we achieved what we set out to do? I think a lot of lessons are ineffective simply because there was no target specified. Oh, there was information that was to be covered, but there was no end game. There was no, okay, what are the students supposed to do with this? How is this going to help advance them as they progress through this course? Or is this just another topic that we're exposing them to? Basically, we're making them voyeurs by just exposing them to information and then moving on. We don't have a specific goal in mind. Well, the question on the slide certainly is a relevant one. Are you writing curriculum goals or are you writing instructional goals? Certainly we have to do both, but when we're talking about instruction, we should be focusing more on instructional goals, not on the curricular goals. So we're going to look at those in this first section. I like guiding questions. As you know, these kind of focus where we're going to be. We don't have a lot of time, so we have to really be targeted, strategic in what we do attempt to look at. So the first guiding question, is there a difference between curriculum goals and objectives and instructional goals and objectives? And I think the answer is obvious, that there is a difference, so we're going to look at what that difference is in this lesson. Secondly, what are the 3 domains of learning? You probably had these in your educational psychology class and a prep program, but we're going to look at them in terms of, are we addressing these in our teaching? Or are we just assuming that they're being addressed because we've taught? So I'm going to call you back to what you already know. This is good practice, and that is identifying how our instruction addresses the 3 domains of learning. Lastly, in this section, we're going to look at how are instructional goals and objectives written. There's actually a process to doing it. And I would think that in reality, identifying goals and objectives, instructional goals and objectives, that is, would be far more important than identifying the topic that you're going to cover, because this really is what you're going to be measuring when you measure your teaching. Planning for instruction happens in a lot of different ways, and each of us that teach do it a little differently. Some take a topical approach. They know the topics that they want to communicate in the course. And they have taught it enough times, they kind of know the order in which they want to address these topics. There is just a natural lay of these topics, and they fit well together in a certain order, and you've taught them enough times, so you just teach it from a topical approach. Now, there's another approach, and this is often followed by people who are really new to teaching, or maybe new to the subject. In other words, they've just started teaching, and they've been given a new teaching prep, and so they will take the textbook and they will follow very closely with what the textbook presents, as well as the order in which it's presented. So basically, when they teach, they are covering what the textbook covers, and that's about it, and nothing more. They might make an ancillary comment from time to time, but most often it's really limited to just what the textbook has for them. There's a third approach, which is a standards approach, which says, I'm not even going to look at what the textbook says. The textbook is there for a reference for the students, and so therefore I'm going to look at the standards that I must address in the course. And then what order they address them in is my prerogative as the teacher, and then you go and match those standards with the textbook topics, and you lay out a plan basically that says, okay, we're going to cover these topics in this order because these are the standards that need to be addressed. And in many cases, when you do a standards approach, you will take standards that may not be grouped together, but you group them together. In other words, they're just listed in a list of standards, and you start pulling standards together that are related, and you teach them as a unit. And so a lot of times people who do a unit approach will use standards as the basis for identifying what's going to be covered. The last style of planning, and I don't guess in the strictest sense it could be considered planning, would be shooting from the hip. And I know several people that's how they do. They just kind of go in there and they have a general idea of what they're going to cover, and they start at the beginning of the period and they go to the end. Those who do this well, I've probably been teaching for a long time, and so they just know the material well enough. They don't need any of those other artificial schemes that kind of put curriculum together and instruction together. They kind of just know what they're going to say, and they say it. People who don't do it well, wow, it's painful, because there's a lot of gaps then in what students get, and they miss things that they need, and it's a really terrible method for planning, because basically it's not planning, it's just kind of getting up there and going. So I don't advocate that, yet I recognize it as, for some, it is a valid planning tool. I've provided a couple of definitions for you that I think would be important at this point to look at. First of all, it's the instructional goal. This is a statement of performance that is expected of each student. So it is an expectation is the key word there, and it's expected of every student, not just a whole class of students, but it's expected by each student. The instructional objective is a statement of performance that is demonstrated by each student. So there is something that is observable there in what the student is doing, doing being the operative word. So when I ask the question, which one is measurable, the answer is instructional objective, because we measure what we can see, what we can observe. And so an objective is a demonstration, and it may be a physical demonstration where a student stands up and recites something, or they answer a question, or they present a topic or a paper, or they complete an assignment. But in any case, whatever it is something that the student is doing. So in both cases, the goal and the objective relates to the student, not to an entire grade or a class or a school. And the difference is, one is an expectation, the other is a demonstration. So we want to measure the objectives. That's why we use objectives, is because we not only say, this is what I want you to be able to do, but I also want to see you do it. And at what level of mastery do I want that performance to be at? And so those are two important definitions when it comes to instruction. Where do these instructional goals come from? What's the source of them? Well, first and foremost, they come from the curriculum, because the curriculum goals outline what the curriculum is trying to achieve, what the expectation is for each student as related to the curriculum. And so from the curriculum, we get instructional goals. And then from the goals, we define or design instructional objectives. And it is the objective at the instruction level and at the curriculum level that we measure. So when we evaluate the curriculum, we evaluate the objectives, and those are the things that are demonstrated as a result of being exposed to the curriculum. And then the same thing with instruction. Instructional objectives are the things that students demonstrate to show that they understand and have mastered what the teacher is stating. Now, there are some that would say instructional goals come from the standards. And again, those that take a standards approach to planning, that's going to make a lot of sense. So that they use the standards to define goals. And the standards, in most cases, for all intents and purposes, become the instructional goals. And then it is those instructional goals that are then developed into objectives that get measured. So this is kind of where they come from. And then from here is where we want to move on into a little bit more specifically the instructional goal side and how we actually develop them. We've already talked that instructional goals come from the curriculum itself, the goals that are identified by the curriculum. And that makes sense because, again, if you adopt a philosophy that curriculum drives instruction, then it would make sense that that's where instructional goals would come from. And that if the objectives come from instruction, we probably should define a little bit more specifically where that is. And the authors, Oliva and Gordon, have come up with 4 sources that really define where the objectives are from. First and foremost is the instructor himself or herself. What the instructor does in the class can become an objective in and of itself. What the teacher teaches then becomes the objectives, and that's what becomes measurable. Secondly, the topics, the content that's to be covered, certainly is an objective that we want to measure. And remember that objectives are all about measurement. The goal is the target, but the objective is the indicator that says you've achieved the target. So the content becomes a source of objectives and helps us to state that objective clearly. Then there's the behavior, and we'll talk a little bit more about behaviorism as it relates to instruction, but there are certain behaviors that we want to instill in the students. And this may be to think critically about a particular issue, or to have an appreciation of prose, whatever it may be. So there's behaviors that we feel that we want to instill in those students, and an appreciation of modern art, whatever the case may be. But again, that becomes an objective, and it needs to be something that is measurable. And certainly an appreciation of something can be measured. We have different degrees of appreciation. Lastly, there are some general terms, and we call these the specific outcomes that we want to be able to measure, and that students should master and demonstrate mastery as a part of the course. And so these become very specific statements about writing prose, defending a point of view when it comes to a style of art or a cause for the Revolutionary War. So again, there are specific things, specific terms that we want to be able to address as a part of a course objective that students must be able to do in order to say they have mastered Algebra 2. There are certain things that they must be able to do in order to say that that's been achieved. So these are just 4 ways of framing the objectives. They also could be considered 4 sources of objectives as well. There is some discussion about the value of identifying behavioral goals, and the author spent some time talking about that in the chapter and how they should be used. And basically we can look at them from either a pro or con position. Those who are in favor of defining behavioral goals would argue first and foremost that they're very precise about what is to be done. A student is supposed to understand, define, demonstrate, identify something. And so, because they're precise, they can be very precise, it makes it easier to measure. Other people argue that they're just a waste of time. We really don't need to do that. It is the standard itself that we need to measure, not someone's attitude towards or their appreciation of or their understanding of. Secondly, it makes it clear to the students, the proponents of it argue, that they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. But then those who oppose them say they're dehumanizing because they're almost training a child in a certain way to say certain things, do certain things, and they're not allowed that individuality. They're treated as an it rather than an individual. They're easy to evaluate, and they certainly are. You can set up rubrics that will measure a person's ability to identify something, understand, or to appreciate. But those, on the other hand, argue that they restrict creativity, that you don't allow students that freedom to choose how they will demonstrate their mastery of the standard or of the content. And so the behavioral objectives or behavioral goals tend to constrict that freedom. But those who value them and feel they're useful argue that they make it possible to hold people accountable. And so they're great for accountability requirements. On the other hand, those who argue against them say, no, you know what, these behavioral goals tend to just focus on trivial things because they focus on things that are easy to measure, not necessarily things that are important to measure. Lastly, those who are in favor of them say they make great tools because they are easy to sequence and we can put them in a very logical order. Well, I got to tell you, based on what I've read, I have not found any data to show that they lead to increased achievement. Matter of fact, I don't think anybody's really studying behavioral goals and how useful they are. Certainly, when you read the literature, you find that they are helpful in instructional planning. They follow a formula, and it makes them very mechanical, and therefore others can develop them fairly easy, whether they have a really strong knowledge of curriculum development, anyone can develop a behavioral goal when you show them the formula. The downside, again, is that they don't allow for a lot of creativity. They're really rigid. The other thing is that most behavioral goals focus on cognitive domains, or the cognitive domain, and therefore there's not a lot of development in the affective or in the psychomotor, and so they would argue that they don't make a lot of sense from that standpoint. I don't really take a position on them. I use them because that seems to be what everyone wants us to do. They work for me, but again, you could make a case, and a very strong one, I think, for not including instructional goals, or behavioral goals, in your planning of the curriculum or even planning instruction. Some things to remember when it comes to preparing instructional goals and objectives. Because instructional goals come from curriculum goals, they must be directly related to the curriculum goal, because remember that instruction is really the implementation. For all intents and purposes, it is the implementation of the curriculum, and so therefore those instructional goals should come right out of the curriculum goals, and those curriculum goals should be turned into instructional goals. They should be linked and specified to each of the three domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. But also, we need to identify both low and high levels of learning as we prepare the goals and objectives. So we need to address what we're going to do for the minimum threshold of achievement, as well as that advanced level. What about the kid who is in that 25th percentile and down, that lowest quartile? What are we going to do for him? What about the student who's at the 93rd percentile and in that top quartile? How are we going to challenge him? How are we going to bring the lowest up, and how are we going to challenge those that are at the top end of the scale? And of course, then the focus then needs to be on helping every student at every percentile and in every quartile in achievement advance, increase in their understanding. And then lastly, when you prepare instructional goals, just follow some very simple rules of writing. And there's a formula. That's what I talked about before, that there's a formulaic approach to writing instructional goals and objectives. And we just need to follow that. So let's take a look at how instructional goals and objectives are related to curriculum goals, and see the relationship between the two. And so here is the curriculum goal. Over the course of the year, students will appreciably improve their skills in reading. Remember that a goal is a very broad, generalized statement. And so when we look at the curriculum objective for the grade level, then we see that curriculum objective is, by the end of the 8th month, 75% of the students will have increased their ability to interpret a selected set of English words. There's the curriculum objective for all of the students in a particular grade level. So notice that it is very specific. That curriculum objective is very specific. By the end of the year, basically, 2/3 of the students will have increased their ability to comprehend a selected set of English words by 25%. Now, when we take that and turn that into an instructional goal, and then ultimately objective, look at this. Here's how we've identified it. We've now identified it to a particular class. So the goal is the student is expected to read new material silently without difficulty. And the objective is the student will read silently a passage from the 5th grade reader and then summarize orally without appreciable error in comprehension each of its 4 points. Notice that the instructional goal, curriculum goals are very generalized, and they're not really that measurable because there is no scale. And the objectives, on the other hand, are very, very specific. The curriculum goal says by a certain time a certain percentage will have advanced their understanding or their comprehension of a selected set of words by 25% at least. The instructional objective, though, is a little bit different. We have gone so far as to identify that it is a passage from the 5th grade reader, and they will summarize orally without appreciable error and comprehension each of its 4 points. So we're looking at specific things that they're going to be able to do, and I would suspect that it would be even more specific than that. An instructional objective would be tied to a particular topic on a particular day or within a particular unit. But here you at least begin to see that the objectives are much more specific than the goal, and really then as we look into this deeper, we're going to look at as you write a goal, as you write an objective rather, you identify what is to be done, when it is to be done, and by what measure it is to be assessed. So we've identified the what, and I should say the who also, 75% of students, and the what is the measure. They will increase their understanding of English words by 25%. So again, you see there is the when, the who, the what, and so forth. So again, these are much more specific when we look at objectives versus those goals. But this is a relationship, is really what I want you to see here, is the relationship between the curriculum and the instruction. Probably doesn't get a lot of attention in your planning. It should, but it very often doesn't. It's kind of something that you did when you were in your college program, but now that you're out teaching, you don't necessarily think about these. There are 3 domains of learning: the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor. And so the cognitive probably is very self-explanatory. It's what we want students to know from the curriculum, from our instruction. And typically we use these strategies of memorization and then some kind of recall, memory, and then do they comprehend? The affective is related to what we want the students to feel and believe. And so the emphasis of the affective is then on emotion, students' emotion. Do they accept, do they reject what they're being told, and the values that come from it. Certain values are borne out, empathy and sympathy and so forth. The final one is psychomotor, which would relate to what we want the students to be able to do. So this is an ability domain, and they are demonstrating their ability to do something. But what we miss out on is that we combine this with the cognitive, and so we think, well, when we want them to demonstrate what they know, we have them do something. Well, that's psychomotor, movement, perception, that kind of thing. And so we need to have all 3 of these in our teaching. And of course that begs the question, which of these gets most of the attention in your classroom? I would be willing to tell you that it's, without a doubt, it's going to be a focus on the cognitive. Unless you're a physical education teacher, you might do a little bit more with psychomotor, or maybe even if you're in an elementary classroom, you might do a little bit more psychomotor, because you're having them getting up and doing things, moving around, dancing to the beat, reciting words and keeping in time with the rhythm of the music or something. But as you get advanced in from elementary to secondary, most of the focus is on psychomotor, and then a little bit on affective, but not very much. Let's go ahead and take a look at the domains of learning, and we'll begin with the cognitive domain. And this really is the result of a lot of the research conducted by Benjamin S. Bloom. And you can see on the left side of this slide the original levels that Bloom came up with, which was began with knowledge and ended with evaluation. And then it was updated by some of his students years later to begin with remember, and then understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. So let's take a look at these. The lowest level of cognition, the lowest level of cognitive development, just requires that the student be able to recall facts. It's based on memorization, such as, what is the capital of the state of Alabama? It's a recall question. What's 2 times 2? Recall question. If you basically regurgitate what the teacher gives you. More advanced would be understand, and that relates to a student's ability to explain ideas. Why did the Civil War start? That's an explanation. What was the cause of the Civil War? Why is 2 times 2 4? You can explain those ideas and concepts. You have a greater level of knowledge. You understand the deeper aspects of that concept. Then, when you can get to the point where you can use this information in a new situation, then you really have achieved a level of application. It's not just regurgitating what you hear and giving back to the teacher what he or she gave you, or even giving an explanation. It's when you can take that information and put it in a new situation and apply it to, for example, the causes of the American Civil War. How were they similar to those causes in Somalia or Ethiopia? Again, you're taking one situation and using it in another situation. That takes you to the level of application. Then we get to the higher order thinking skills at the analyze, evaluate, and create level. Because at the analysis level, you are drawing conclusion. You have the ideas, you have an explanation, and you can recall the facts, but it takes more work to analyze something. And we used to say that when you analyzed as a part of this cognitive domain, you were taking concepts and breaking them into smaller pieces so that you could look at each piece individually and see how it fit together with other pieces. Then we get to the level of evaluate, where it's not and I think, evaluate is a little bit confusing of a term. I like the term synthesis, because you are synthesizing your analysis to be able to come to a decision, make that decision, and then stand by that decision or that position or opinion. And so at this evaluate stage, you're able to draw a conclusion and then defend that conclusion by looking at the data. Finally, the highest level of the cognitive development and domain is the create level, and this is where you are able to produce new and original work based on what you've learned. So we're not just taking ideas and putting them in new situations. We're actually developing new ideas, original works that no one has ever seen before. So this is one of the areas where we need to challenge our students. And within this area, we need to be sure that we are providing opportunities for students to remember and understand, as well as apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. The affective domain involves these levels, which is receiving and attending, responding, valuing, organizing, and characterizing or characterization. And as I've said, that the affective domain deals with our emotions and what we think, how we empathize, how we sympathize with others. Unfortunately, This is not an area that is stressed by teachers because they don't value this area, nor is it really valued by parents because the teachers don't value it. They see emotional development as something that should happen at home or at church or somewhere else. It is not an aim of the school. Of course, I would argue then, why do we spend so much time teaching character education? If the home and school are doing it, home and church are doing it, why should the school do it at all? Well, it's simply because the home and the church are not doing it to the extent that they need to. So these attitudes that we want to instill in children need to be instilled somewhere, and it seems to be that the school is left to do it. So we want to develop our students' character and their sensitivity to the needs and concerns of others, and that's really what this domain does. Because it is not tested on any curriculum, I can see why there are those who don't value it, because they say, well, it's not measured, so it obviously is not that important. But I think that it's in school where oftentimes we learn about fairness, how to give others a turn, how to handle defeat, to be a good loser. Those are concepts that are taught in schools, and while they may be taught at home, and while they may even be taught at church, the reality is school is where you learn a lot, because you have athletic events, so you know how to be a good sport, and you learn about honesty and fairness and working hard. Those are great character traits that build up the person. And certainly the school is a good place, I think, for those to be taught, because you have the students for a significant amount of time, and there are opportunities to work on those individual attitudes where that may not necessarily happen at home. And I would submit to you that most often it does not happen at home, and therefore the church must do it, and if the church doesn't pick up, then who does? So this affective domain is another area, and certainly one that we need to make sure that as we teach, we're giving students opportunities to develop this area of their brain as well. Finally, the psychomotor domain, of course, is the one that we use most often in physical education. It's probably the least known of the domains. We just don't emphasize this area as much, and yet if you talk to your PE teacher, this would be an area that would be very important to them as they help students develop fine motor skills as well as gross motor skills, and so psychomotor is one that can be very important to classroom teachers, because if students have poor handwriting, it may mean that they need to develop this area and give opportunities for movement. Howard Gardner said that there are some students who they demonstrate their knowledge through movement. They learn through movement, and they need to be moving to a rhythm to memorize facts or to learn bits of information. They call them kinesthetic learners. And so this is an area that rarely gets touched on by any of the classroom teachers. They're worried just about what does the student know, the cognitive, and maybe helping the child to develop an appreciation for things, or maybe a few character traits, but psychomotor is probably the least looked at by any of them, because again, this definitely does not get tested in any way, shape, or form, unless it is in a physical education class. So I present it not because I want to spend a lot of time talking about it and giving you opportunities to make lesson plan connections, but just to know that it's out there. You are already aware of this if you have taken a educational psychology class, and so, like I said, I don't want to beat that horse to death, as it were. So again, just making you aware that these are the domains. We do need to find ways to get students into movement. For instance, when we looked at guided response, of course, that involves role playing. And so there are a lot of ways that you can bring movement into your lessons and make them more engaging by getting students physically involved in the learning process. Not just getting their mind, getting their attention, getting their emotional connection, but also getting that physical connection. And when you teach to all of these domains, you are teaching a well-rounded lesson. And that, to me, is the goal of any teacher, is to touch on all three of these domains. I've already told you that we need to write instructional goals and instructional objectives, and that I would provide you with some guidelines to help you do that. So here we go. This is some rules for writing objectives. And that first rule involves specifying the behavior that's to be expected. Now, when you do this from a behavioral perspective, and I've already told you that there are those who don't agree with that focus on learning, you choose words that are verbs to show actions, what the student will do, the behavior that the student is to adopt. And so I've given you some examples here of identify, apply, judge, explain, evaluate, appreciate. Notice that I am not using the word understand here. The student will understand. And simply because understanding is one of those terms that are very difficult to measure, because understanding is not observable. It's very difficult to measure, as I've said, but it's also not something you can just simply watch and see a student understanding, because understanding and comprehension are connected. So when you go back to the cognitive domain here, then notice that when we're looking at understanding, that it's related to remembering, and it's a combination of remembering and understanding, and the ability to recall facts and explain ideas. That's really tough to do, to measure their ability to recall information. Basically, comprehension and really understanding, for that matter, is a combination of knowledge and time. It takes time to understand something. It's not just something that happens as soon as you read it. So we want to choose words, again, that are measurable, that they're observable, that we can quantify them. And so first rule is that your objectives should be measurable. They should be specific in explaining what it is that you want to see happen. The second rule is identifying the conditions under which the behavior is to be demonstrated. And so a way to word this would be, given this circumstance, X, the student will explain, apply, demonstrate, whatever. So you could say, given appropriate manipulatives, the student will demonstrate a straight line. The student will draw a straight line. That's very basic, but you get the idea, where we set the conditions for which the student must meet that condition, and then we can measure. So one of the things that I point out here as a sidebar is you don't necessarily state the obvious. So given a sheet of paper and a pen, the student will write an essay on the merits of government-sponsored health care. Of course, we don't need to state that they have a sheet of paper. The student will write an essay. We assume it either is typed or it's written on paper, but that's not the condition. It's, can the student write the essay? The third rule identifies the level of mastery, the degree of mastery. At what point should this student be at? And so I give an example here. The student will write an essay on the merits of government-sponsored healthcare with no more than 3 grammatical or stylistic errors. So that sets the threshold. If they get more than 3, then they have not met the objective. Obviously, 3 or less, they're good to go. So these are just 3 basic rules to help guide you as you develop objectives for your instruction. Having identified our instructional goals and objectives, now let's focus on the instructional strategies that we are going to use to convey the information. And I'm going to give you some of these. These are not going to be terribly radical or cutting edge. These are ones that you're probably already using now. But again, they are part of the strategy repertoire that most of us have, and so we'll go over those strategies in this next section. So here are the guiding questions. What is the best way to teach a topic? To me, that's a very important question. Is there a best way to teach a topic? Or is there just one strategy that we should use for all topics? Should the topic determine how it's taught? Or should we, as the teacher, say, I'm going to teach this topic using small groups, or I'm going to teach this topic using a lecture? I think that there are some topics that are better demonstrated than they are lectured about. So I tend to lean more towards, I think there is a best way to teach each topic. Yet there are others who believe, no, I'm a lecturer and that's how I teach everything. One method for teaching all topics. But certainly that's something we can think about as we're going through these different strategies. Next, what is the style, model, method, and skills as it relates to selecting instructional strategies? So, do each of us have an instructional style, a method that we kind of lean into as we prepare to teach? I think we have a leadership style for sure, and I would suspect that we also have that teaching style, and it really does guide as we select what methods to use. Lastly, how are generic and specific teaching skills different? We'll look at those in this final section of this podcast. Take a look at this curriculum goal here. It's not an instructional goal, it is a curriculum goal. And think about, how might a person teach this goal if this was what was part of their curriculum? And so I'll read it for you. Explain historical and philosophical origins that shaped the government of the United States, including the Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, the Mayflower Compact, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and the influence of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Charles de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the Great Awakening. How might a person teach it? Because that seems like a lot of individuals and documents. Well, think about that for a moment. How would you teach it if you were teaching that subject? Now, if it were me, what I might do is, first, I would get copies of those documents, and we would do a document analysis, and we would take those original documents and we'd lay them out on the tables, and I might first have the students look at each one and just become familiar with the documents themselves. And then after that, I might group them together and assign one document to each group so that they could become the expert on that document. Or another way to teach it might be to give a group 2 documents and ask them to compare and contrast the documents. Same thing with the philosophers. One could present the philosopher and kind of give a biography on this person, and just kind of hit the relevant high points of their life and what their work was. You could compare philosophers. You could, for instance, create a continuum of philosophers from very conservative to very progressive, and then have the students place these people on a continuum. You could even get the written works of these people, and especially if you were in a high school class. You could get the written works of these men and have the students read through them and be able to evaluate and ultimately be able to compare, contrast these particular works and their merits and their deficits as well. So that's just one way. You could just do a lecture for sure. You could do an internet exploration. That's just a few of the ways that you could bring this goal to your classroom, and of course you would set an instructional goal and an objective for that as well. But you see, there are many ways to teach this one goal, and depending on where your strength is, where your interest is, you have a lot of latitude for how to teach this concept. There are some very common instructional strategies you see on this slide here, and on the left side you see a listing of those particular strategies. The most common and most often used is lecture, and it is used not only here in the United States, but it is used around the world, and it is used from elementary school all the way up through college and university graduate studies as the predominant way to convey information. And I have said this before, and I will say it again, it is probably the least most effective way to get students to learn material, because it is typically auditory. Yes, there may be some visuals that go along with it, but oftentimes it is what we call that sit and get, where you just sit and listen, and there is very little interaction. The teacher is doing all the talking, and basically the job of the student is to learn, take notes, and learn. And like I said, what we know from research on retention, that probably in a lecture, a student will only retain about 10% of what he or she hears, and that 10% will probably only be for the duration of about 48 hours, not much longer than that. Other methods that are becoming very popular, have become very popular, of course, is small group work, where students are broken into groups and the teacher works with those small groups and teaches the lesson, teaches the whatever in that group setting, and then the next group comes and the material is retaught. We've also seen teachers who use discussions, not as often as probably they use lecture, but that also is a very popular one too, is to start a discussion, which allows students to interact with ideas and get their opinion out there, gives them practice defending their opinion. This is one of those higher order thinking skills where they can draw a conclusion and then take a stand and stand by it. Independent study is not as common of a way, so that you have students studying different things that interest just them. Library research is a common instructional strategy, especially when you're approaching a new unit. You schedule some time in the library where students can work on a research endeavor. Maybe you're going to cover that curriculum goal that I just mentioned, and so therefore you're going to have the students look up these famous philosophers or these famous documents. But now with the internet so prevalent, they don't really need to go to the library to do this research. This is something that they can do in the classroom on their Chromebook. Mediated instruction is a little bit different, and again, this is where you're working almost like RTI. You're working at different levels of intensive instruction, where you may be doing whole group with the class one time, and then you're working with the struggling students on another occasion. So again, you go from whole group to small group. Repetitive drill, not very common anymore, but yet was at one time. But still, some people use drill and kill as a way to convey information. And laboratory experiences are still very common in the sciences, and a way to practice the things that were taught in lectures. So the question is, how do you choose the teaching strategy? Is it chosen based on your instructional objective? Does the subject matter determine that method? Is it a community decision where that all of the teachers within the school community have said, this is how we're going to teach? Is it driven by textbooks, or is it even driven by student needs? Whichever way, there is a way you choose. Most often it is left to that one at the bottom. The teacher chooses the strategy that he or she will use to convey information. So most of us are going to fit one of these strategies here, and I would submit to you most often it's going to be that lecture is the strategy that we use of choice. Because again, it is one of the most efficient ways the teacher controls what's going on. And it does keep the class quiet, but it also tends to be the least efficient, and it's also the method that does not engage the students as much as other methods do. When you think about how you choose the instructional methods that you use, there are some guidelines. You know, I said there's a listing there. Does that cause you to choose? There are some guidelines. First of all, you've got to consider the need of the learner. Your lecture may be great because you really like doing it, but if the students don't grasp what you're saying because it's auditory and they need something visual or they need something kinesthetic, then you need to adjust how you teach. Because even though you may have taught, that doesn't mean that they've learned. You've got to meet the students based on their need, not on just how you prefer to teach. Yes, we can't forget your preferences, though, either. Your style and your philosophy do have a place in the selection of what method to use. You don't want to use a method where you're not comfortable or where you're not capable. It'd be great if everybody liked doing discussions, and your students really learned best when they were able to work with ideas in a discussion format. But again, if that's not your strength as a teacher, then you probably don't want to use it, or really, you shouldn't use it. There are times, though, that the subject may determine how it's best to convey that information. There are times when I look at the subject that I'm going to be teaching and realize that maybe a hands-on activity is going to really be the best way to teach. So if I'm going to talk about decision-making models, I might have the students develop their own model first and see if they understand what really needs to be in a model in order to make it a useful tool. Time is another guideline that we cannot lose sight of. Because if we have a short amount of time, then we probably can't use an experiment that takes an hour and a half when we only have 50 minutes. So we do have to be conscious of time. And so while there may be some great strategies we want to use, if they don't fit our time, then of course we can't use them. Another constraint that will help us decide what methods to use, of course, is the resources that we have. If you want to use a technology-based resource and you don't have enough computers or Chromebooks for everybody, then it really isn't fair to use that method. Well, too bad. Half the class didn't have computers, so they really couldn't participate. No, that wouldn't make any sense. So the resources that you have, whether it be supplies or whether it be the equipment, is going to help you to determine what you do. The facilities is another area where we have to consider. Do we have the facilities to make it safe for us to use this particular instructional strategy? So if you don't have a lab that has a hood, or the lab with the hood is not available, well, then you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that experiment. So certainly your facilities are going to determine what kinds of instructional strategies that you use. And lastly, your instructional objectives are going to speak greatly into what resources you use and what methods that you use in order to convey that information. Again, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And so that certainly is going to speak into how you choose the instructional method to convey your information. Think for a moment about your teaching style. What is it? I've listed some here on the right side of the slide. Are you facilitative, where your teaching style is more of a conversation, and you're helping the students explore this topic, and you're there as a resource for them, not as the expert or the sage on the stage. You are there to help them in their inquiry of the topic. Your style may be very directive, especially in elementary classrooms. We find that the teacher has to be more directive. Okay, do this, then do that, and then do the third thing. You may be task-oriented, and therefore the goal of your class is to finish the project, finish the assignment, finish the homework. And your style then is to teach so that they can finish whatever the task is that they're going to be assigned to do. You may be more of a dramatic teacher, which means you're into role plays, and you're going to dress up as a particular person. I remember in one of my schools I had a teacher who was very dramatic. And usually 2 or 3 times during the semester in her history classes, she would dress up as a character that she was going to be talking about. And she would teach the lesson as if it was the character teaching the lesson. So I remember one time she came dressed up as George Washington. And she taught her 8th grade history class from George Washington's perspective on the Revolutionary War and his feelings about the war. Very entertaining, very engaging. I watched her teach that day because I was just curious. I had never seen anybody who did that, and she did a lot of research so that she was a very convincing George Washington, and she dispelled some of the myths that people have about George Washington, as well as conveying information that was important to her lesson. She did cover the content standards, but she also was able to do the dramatic side, which engages students. You may be a humorous teacher, which means that you teach through humor and entertain students like a stand-up comedian. Maybe not to the degree of a stand-up comedian, but you're one of those people that believe that education should be entertaining. And so you will conduct your class in a way that allows you to perform for the students. Whichever style you choose, whichever style really represents who you are as a teacher, that is the style that should govern how you teach then. If you are a facilitative teacher, then probably the lecture is not going to be the way that's best for you to teach, because that is not consistent with your style. Group work probably is not going to be conducive to someone who is very humorous and someone who is more of an entertainer or a performer. So your style, your teaching style, is going to have a bearing on your instructional style. Is there a model for teaching that we should all follow? And then, if there is a model, who determines what that model is? Well, let me answer the first question. Is there a model? No. I think that there are as many ways to teach as there are teachers out there. Do I think it's always determined by the teacher? No. I think there are sometimes that the learner helps to determine that model based on their needs. But also there are times when the subject has something to say about how we teach and the curriculum. So I think it's really a matter of all of the above in determining that model of how you're going to convey information in the classroom. Now, the man you see pictured here, Dr. Mark Ankeny, was my major professor in my doctoral program. And he taught probably a third of the classes that I took in my graduate doctoral program. And I remember one time that he came to class, and he had a thermos. I think it was a thermos, might have been a jug. Anyway, a jug of kind of reddish liquid. And he had little paper cups. And as he started, we were going to be talking about making observations as instructional leaders and how to observe situations. So anyway, he took the juice and he poured it into cups. And then he handed it out to us and he told us, take a drink of the juice. And so, you know, you heard those jokes about, ooh, they drank the Kool-Aid, referring to the Jim Jones disaster of the late 70s, where the cult leader poisoned all of his followers by poisoning the Kool-Aid they were drinking. Well, of course, someone made that joke in the class, and then we all laughed. But after that, he said, now I want you to listen to the juice. And I have not forgotten that in almost 20 years. I have not forgotten that night when we sat there and we were supposed to think about the juice that we had drunk. Now, most people would say, oh my goodness, what a terribly stupid idea, and what a horrible waste of time. But he was getting us to the place where we could describe the sensation that we had as a result of drinking the juice. And people brought back memories of family picnics and family get-togethers and special times that they had. And all of these stories that people told in the class that night were initiated because of the juice. And to me, Dr. Ankeny represents a person who does not have a model of teaching. He just goes in there, and each time it's different. I remember one time that he accidentally forgot his lecture materials that he was going to use. And so instead of doing a lecture that he had planned to do, he came up with a completely different strategy. It still conveyed the information, but did it completely different than the way he had planned to do that night. I would tell you that he is probably, to me, one of the best teachers that I had ever had in my doctoral program, because each time he taught, it was different. It was not the same, okay, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do the same thing. And he was not predictable. You could not say that, okay, well, today he's going to do this. No, he came at it from all outside the box. It was never the same week after week after week. And so what I glean from this is that we can look for a model, but we don't want to be so boxed in by it that we become very predictable to our students, and that they stop listening to us because the model is hindering the learning. I think it's good to have one, but I also think it should never become the trap that doesn't allow us to convey the information in a unique way, that it doesn't become this, okay, this is how we're going to do it, and everybody understands what's going to happen. And basically, we sit there and endure each other for the hour and a half, or however long the class is. So, yes, I think there's a model, and I think all of the groups there do help to determine it, but I also know that there are times when you need to break out of the model so that you aren't in the rut and that you don't get stuck in the routine. Here is an example of a teaching skill, and I've chosen one, discussions. There are others. I mean, lecture is one. I think you know lectures and how to do them. Discussions are one of those skills that a lot of teachers don't use because they're not comfortable in guiding a discussion. Not controlling a discussion, but guiding it. And discussions typically don't get used in classrooms with children or even young adults because the teacher is not the one controlling it. Because if it's controlled, it really doesn't do anywhere near what it can possibly do and have the benefits that it can have. So that a lot of teachers don't feel comfortable enough leading a discussion because some of them, I think, struggle to think on their feet. Because discussions can go 2, 3, 4 different directions. And you have to think about where it is that you want the discussion to go. And instead of dragging it to that place, you have to guide it to that place. And so discussions still have to be productive. Now, there are those, and my brother, who's a teacher, would argue discussions are a waste of time. Because, again, they don't necessarily ensure that you are going to get to the place that you want the students to go, and unless you drag it there. And then I don't see it as a discussion. I just see it more as an interrogation, but not a discussion. So here are some of the aspects of a discussion that if you'll allow it to do what it's intended to do, it can be very profitable to the students. First of all, you've got to recognize that your role is that of a facilitator. Your job is to encourage the discussion to happen. So you ask questions to get things started. You question the opinions of the students, the participants, so that they can clarify things that don't make sense. You challenge the ideas of the students. And this is where you begin to see whether a student truly knows the material, is whether they can defend their position or not. Discussions can stimulate a student's thinking because they may not have thought about what is being discussed or from the topic from that perspective, or something another student says can generate some ideas in their mind and in their thinking. And so I think that discussions can give you far more information than a lecture would ever do. They also sustain interest because they allow students to get engaged in the process, the learning process. Instead of being very passive, sitting there and just listening, they can generate interest and sustain that interest because, again, students are involved in getting their 2 cents out there. But in order for that to happen, we need to be sure that we are relating what's being said to the content that needs to be addressed. So it's got to be relevant, and that's, discussions just for the sake of discussion is not a good reason to have one. Discussions that are related to content are far more beneficial. Yes, we, as the facilitator, our job is to summarize what other people say, to be sure that we are capturing exactly what they're intending. Lastly, another general rule of discussions is don't allow any one person to dominate the conversation. And yet you'll have some out there who are able to discuss and they want to kind of control. And so you can't let any one person, even yourself, control the discussion, or else it just becomes, again, more of an interrogation and a lecture, and the students just sit there and listen and don't participate. It takes some training to get kids to learn how to discuss. They don't naturally know how to do this, so your job is to kind of facilitate it to help teach them how to do it. And eventually they'll become great discussants. And again, it would be a great skill to have. Plus, it's just such a unique way to cover the material. Instead of just you standing at the front with a PowerPoint, having a discussion can be very useful. And again, it can cause a deeper level of learning than just hearing, because they not only have to hear what's being said, they have to be able to apply what somebody else says to what they are saying, what their opinion is. Here's one of the questions that we started out with as a guiding question. Are teaching skills generic or are they specific? Is there a set of teaching skills that every teacher must possess? If you think the answer is yes, well, what might they be? Does every teacher need to be a lecturer? Does every teacher need to be a facilitator? Does everyone need to be a humorist? Or does every teacher need to be dramatic? If no, what skills do the teachers need to have? Are there certain ones? I think that they tend to be generic or generalized, and it's simply because teaching is such a individualized activity. It is a creative art, so that when I step in the classroom to teach, I'm going to do it just a little bit maybe, or maybe a lot, different than the person down the hall from me. I have a different style, they have a different style, so we approach the classroom differently. One may use a lot of data, a lot of facts and figures to support what he's saying, where I may not use as many. So I think that there aren't a specific set of skills. I think that with each teacher, they have a set of abilities, talents, if you will, that will help them to make them successful. The key is helping the teacher identify his or her specific traits. Not saying that all of us have to have the same ones, but that all of us have some specific skills, and we need to tap into those skills and use those skills that we have to the best level of our effectiveness. So, to kind of finish out here in talking about instruction, it is a creative endeavor and very unique to each person, which is what makes it so difficult to say this is what the model is for teaching, because two teachers can approach teaching from different perspectives, different styles, using different strategies and different skills, and students will learn. And it is that uniqueness that we all share. We each approach this from a different perspective of teaching, and yet, amazingly enough, kids learn under different styles of teacher. So this kind of wraps up our session on the instructional goals and objectives and some instructional strategies. Contact me if you need any assistance. I'm always here to help you if I can, and look forward to working with you this week in the discussion threads. Have a good week.